I never thought a house could hold so many memories, both warm and bitter. Yet every corner of the home I shared with my late husband seemed to whisper his voice, his laughter, even his absence. It was a modest house in the suburbs of Chicago, built with his hands, sweat, and love. To anyone else, it was just a house, a property with 4 walls and a roof. To me, it was a treasury of our life together, a testament to the sacrifices we made, and a sanctuary for the little world I tried to build for my son, Ethan. When my husband, Daniel, passed away 10 years ago, it felt like the walls themselves mourned with me. He had been my partner, my protector, and the one person I trusted without question. His death left a hollow ache inside me, but I told myself that as long as I had Ethan, I could endure anything. Ethan was 8 years old when his father died. Small, bright-eyed, endlessly curious. He was the only light in the shadow Daniel left behind. I promised him, as I had promised myself, that I would keep him safe, happy, and loved. That no misfortune, no betrayal, would ever touch him. I worked tirelessly. 2 jobs, long nights, weekends spent fixing what needed fixing around the house. There were times I skipped meals just so Ethan could have the things he wanted: a new bike for his birthday, books he was dying to read, the soccer cleats he had been begging for. I didn't think of it as sacrifice. I thought of it as love, a mother's love. Over the years, Ethan grew into a young man who was polite, charming, and thoughtful. At least, that's what I saw. He was intelligent, sometimes a little stubborn, and fiercely independent. I remember the day he graduated high school. I cried when he shook my hand, proud beyond words. Daniel would have been proud too, I thought. I wanted Ethan to chase his dreams, to never feel limited by our modest means. That was my mission, my devotion, my life's purpose. Then, when he was 25, he met Chloe. I met her for the first time at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place I'd taken Ethan to when he was little. She was beautiful, smiling, and polite. The kind of person you assumed would fit perfectly into a family. At least, that's the assumption I made. I trusted her. Or rather, I wanted to. I wanted my son to be happy. That desire, though simple in its intent, would later become the lever that would drive the entire story of betrayal. Their engagement came with the usual excitement: invitations, dresses, parties. I spent weeks helping Chloe plan her bridal shower, arranging flowers and buying gifts. I imagined them moving into a home together, building their life like Ethan and I had always dreamed. I didn't know then that the life I envisioned for them would slowly turn into the nightmare I would have to engineer revenge against. The day of the wedding was sunny and bright, the kind of day that makes you think life is perfect, even if only for a moment. I sat in the pew, smiling, trying not to cry as Chloe and Ethan exchanged vows. There was a warmth in that day, a hope that maybe life was gentle, that maybe our family, though changed, would still remain intact. After the wedding, they moved into an apartment in downtown Chicago. It was sleek, modern, and expensive. I remember feeling a pang of concern when they first told me about it. "It's a good deal, Mum," Ethan had said, grinning. "The neighborhood is safe." "You'd love it," I didn't argue. I trusted him, as any mother trusts her child. I even helped them with part of the down payment, seeing it as an investment in their future. Little did I know that trust was about to be the very thing they used to betray me. In the quiet moments after their departure, I often wandered the halls of the house I had lived in with Daniel and Ethan. The memories were everywhere. The framed photograph of Ethan at his first soccer game, Daniel's old toolbox still in the garage, the little dent in the dining table where Ethan had once slammed his hand in frustration as a child. It was all so ordinary, yet so sacred. And perhaps, because I loved it so dearly, I failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface of our family. Ethan's texts and calls were regular at first. He would ask about groceries, about bills, about whether I needed anything. Chloe would call, laugh softly over the phone, and I would smile, feeling that everything was okay. But slowly the tone began to change. Small things at first, delays in visits, cancelled phone calls, little excuses that didn't feel like excuses. I told myself it was normal. After all, they were busy starting their life together. But instinctively, I felt a subtle shift, like the calm before a storm. It was 2 years after their marriage that the first real blow came. I remember that evening vividly. I was folding laundry in the living room, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting a golden light across the room. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. "Mom, I think it's time we talk about the house. It's just for safety reasons. I think it should be in my name." Now I froze. My heart pounded. Safety reasons, I thought. We had never had problems with the house. It was in a good neighborhood. Everything had been maintained. I trusted him, though, as any mother would. I trusted him because he was my son. I replied carefully, trying to understand what he meant. "Ethan, you know I've taken care of this house for years. Your father and I built it. What kind of safety issues are there?" The reply came quickly. "Mum, it's just easier this way. The legal stuff, taxes, things are simpler if it's in my name. Please trust me." I hesitated. I could feel a tight knot in my stomach, but I brushed it away. I had always taught Ethan to be responsible, to make wise decisions. Perhaps this was part of that. Perhaps he knew better. I didn't realize that trusting him blindly would be the first step in the chain of betrayal that would unfold. That night, I sat alone in the house, staring at the dining table where Daniel used to sit. The memories pressing in on me like a physical weight. I thought about the years I had spent protecting Ethan, about the sacrifices I had made, about the love I had poured into him. And I felt a small, uneasy chill, like the first hint of winter creeping in. I didn't know it then, but that chill was the beginning, the first whisper of a storm that would one day engulf not just the house, but our entire family. The days after Ethan's message about transferring the house were uneasy. I tried to convince myself it was normal, that he was just trying to make life simpler for both of us. But deep down, a small voice kept whispering that something was wrong. I ignored it. Because how could my own son betray me? That thought never even crossed my mind before. A week later, Ethan called again. I remember the voice on the other end, casual, almost cheerful. "Mum, Chloe and I have made a decision. We're selling the house." I froze, clutching the phone tightly. The words echoed in my ears like a hammer. "What? Ethan? What are you talking about?" I managed to whisper. "It's in my name now. Remember?" We found a buyer. It's for the best I couldn't breathe. The walls of the house, my sanctuary, my memories, everything my husband had built, suddenly felt foreign. I felt like an intruder in my own life. "Ethan, this house, this isn't just property. This is our home. Your father built this for us, for you. How can you sell it?" There was a pause on the line, then a shrug I could almost hear in his voice. "Mum, it's just a house. We need the money for Chloe's new business, for the apartment. It's nothing personal. I promise, nothing personal." Those words hit me harder than anything else ever could. Nothing personal. as if all the love, all the years, all the sweat and tears meant nothing. I didn't say anything after that. I couldn't. My voice would have betrayed me. That night, I wandered through the house, touching every wall, every piece of furniture. I remembered the day Daniel had painted the living room. I remembered Ethan as a little boy running through the hallway, his laughter echoing off the walls. I remembered the night we moved in, the excitement, the dreams. And now, all of it was being sold, handed over to strangers, erased. The movers came a week later. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They packed our lives into cardboard boxes while I stood by, helpless. My photographs, the little trinkets I had saved over decades, the piano Daniel had played every Christmas, all gone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry out. I simply watched, because I knew, deep down, that whatever I did now, nothing would stop them. They were blind to their own greed. And yet, I felt a spark. A small, cold spark deep inside me that whispered, "This isn't over." The days that followed were tense. Ethan and Chloe called occasionally, not to apologize, but to ask for advice, mostly about what to do with the sale money or where to invest it. Each time I kept my voice calm, my demeanor neutral. But inside, I was already plotting. I started to notice small things that gave me insight into their life. Chloe's expensive tastes, Ethan's overconfidence, the way they flaunted their wealth online. Pictures of dinners in fancy restaurants, vacations to places I could barely afford. They were living a life built on my loss. And every smile, every post, every brag fueled the fire that had begun quietly inside me. One evening, a week after the sale, Chloe called me. I could hear the background noise, laughter, music, expensive cutlery clinking. "Hi, Mum," she said sweetly. "We're just settling into the apartment. Everything's perfect." "That's good," I said softly. "Mum, do you know if Ethan transferred the rest of the money yet?" "The buyer sent it to the account, but we need to confirm." Her tone was casual, but I heard the greed beneath it. I smiled softly. "I'm not sure, Chloe. Maybe you should check with Ethan." She laughed lightly. "You're such a mom, always so careful." Careful. That was one word that now felt like a weapon, because yes, I was careful. And from this carefulness, a plan began to form. A plan that would ensure their greed and betrayal would have consequences. The first few weeks, I stayed silent. I observed. I watched their online posts, their growing arrogance. They had no idea that I had retained copies of the transfer documents, receipts, and even the emails from the buyer. I had every transaction recorded, every move they made documented. It wasn't revenge yet. Not overtly, but I could see the cracks forming in their facade. Chloe had borrowed money for furniture she didn't really need. Ethan had overextended himself with investments he didn't understand. And I had all the pieces I needed to let karma unfold naturally. I remember one night, sitting in the darkened living room of the apartment I had moved into temporarily, staring at the old photographs of Daniel and Ethan. The moonlight spilled across the walls, and I could almost hear Daniel's voice. "You've raised him well. Don't lose yourself." I realized then that revenge didn't have to be violent. It didn't have to be cruel in the obvious sense. It could be patient, calculated, a slow-burning fire that would consume them from the inside out. And that was exactly what I intended to do. A month after the house was sold, the first real sign of trouble came. Chloe called again, her voice strained, almost panicked. "Mom, Ethan's account. There's some issue. The bank says there's a problem with the transfer. We don't have access to the funds." I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft sigh. I'm sure it's just a mistake, Chloe. Banks make mistakes all the time. Just be patient. No, Mom. It's serious. They froze everything. The buyer, the documents. Something's wrong. Her voice trembled, and for the first time, I felt a small, satisfying chill. Chloe? Maybe it's time to slow down and think carefully about your decisions, I said, keeping my tone soft, almost motherly. She didn't respond immediately, only a shaky, quiet sigh. And in that moment, I realized that the first thread of their unraveling had begun. That night, I sat with my notebook, detailing everything: dates, transactions, calls, receipts, every step Ethan and Chloe had taken against me, every lie, every betrayal. I wasn't writing out of anger. I was writing out of strategy, patient, methodical, precise. Every piece of evidence would become part of the plan that would eventually lead to their downfall. And I felt powerful. Not because I wanted to harm them, but because I finally realized that I didn't have to be a victim. They had underestimated me, the woman they called Mom, the one they assumed would never act. That assumption would be their greatest mistake. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when reality hit me like a punch to the chest. I sat at the small kitchen table of the apartment I had moved into after Ethan and Chloe sold the house. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten, as I scrolled through my emails. And there it was, a notice from the city. Property transfer complete. My home, gone. Sold to strangers who had no idea what those walls had witnessed, what memories they were stepping into. I felt hollow, an emptiness that went deeper than grief. This wasn't just about a house. This was about my life, my family, my trust. Ethan, my son, my own flesh and blood, had handed it over like it was nothing. I thought back to the day he first suggested transferring the house to his name. I had trusted him blindly. I had believed in him, and in that belief, I had made the fatal mistake of signing the papers without hesitation. I had thought he was responsible, that he had my best interest at heart. But trust, blind trust, can be deadly when placed in the wrong hands. That afternoon, I called Ethan. I tried to keep my voice steady, calm, almost conversational. Ethan, I got the notice today. Can we talk? He sounded casual, carefree. Mum, it's all handled. Chloe and I are fine. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. As if my life, my memories, my sacrifices were trivial. That's when the first real seed of anger planted itself deep within me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't cry. I could only sit in the silence, letting the shock and betrayal wash over me. And as the initial wave passed, it left behind a chilling clarity. They thought I was powerless. They thought I would sit back and let them take everything. I remembered Chloe's casual laughter, Ethan's shrug. Their faces, once familiar, now seemed alien. It wasn't just a house they had taken. They had taken my trust, my dignity, my belief that my son would never hurt me. And that realization was more painful than losing the house itself. The next few days were a haze. I walked through the apartment, touching the walls, imagining Daniel beside me, shaking his head at the injustice. Memories of Ethan as a child flashed before my eyes. The first time he rode his bike, the scraped knees, the birthday candles, the late-night homework sessions. How could the boy I had nurtured, loved, and sacrificed everything for become someone capable of such betrayal? I felt anger bubbling beneath the surface. Not blind anger, not the kind that makes you lash out without thinking. This was a quiet, simmering fury, a cold, calculated anger that whispered, "You will pay. You will see what it feels like to lose everything. I began noticing patterns in their behavior. Chloe was obsessed with social media. They posted pictures constantly, vacations, fancy dinners, expensive clothes. Ethan had started investing in risky ventures, bragging about it over the phone. Their arrogance was staggering, their ignorance even more so. And I realized they were playing right into my hands. I didn't confront them immediately. I let them believe they had won. I let them live in their illusion of success. Each photo, each brag, each call where Chloe laughed and Ethan bragged about their wealth fueled my plan. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was preparing. One evening I called Chloe. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "Chloe, how's everything going?" She laughed lightly. "Mom, we're fine." "Really? Don't worry about us. The apartment is beautiful. The house money. Everything's perfect. Their perfect life, built on lies and betrayal." My lips curled into a soft, almost imperceptible smile. "That's good to hear," I replied, letting the words drip with sweetness that masked the storm beneath. It was then that I realized the true power of patience. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to confront them. I just had to wait. Let them make mistakes. Let them reveal themselves. Let them feel safe. And then watch everything crumble. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining the steps I needed to take. My anger was methodical, precise. I knew that any rush, any mistake, could ruin the opportunity for perfect revenge. Ethan had underestimated me. Chloe had underestimated me. And that, I decided, would be their greatest error. I started documenting everything. Every transaction they made related to the house sale, every call, every text. I recorded conversations where they boasted about investments and purchases, not knowing that I had copies of all the original documents, the signed papers, the bank confirmations. I created a map, a detailed timeline of their actions and every misstep. And as I worked, I felt power I hadn't realized I still possessed. For so long, grief had consumed me. But now, grief was paired with purpose, revenge, justice, karma. Whatever you want to call it, I had discovered a new strength, the strength of a mother betrayed, who refuses to be powerless. Weeks passed. I observed them from a distance. Their arrogance grew. They believed themselves untouchable. Chloe bought a designer sofa. Ethan boasted about a sure-thing investment that required liquidating some of their house money. And I watched, silently, letting their greed guide their own destruction. The emotional toll on me was immense, but I learned to mask it. I spoke gently to friends, smiled at strangers, carried myself as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was building a plan. Each conversation, each email, each social media post was another piece of the puzzle. And every time they flaunted what they had taken from me, my resolve grew. I realized something important during this time. Revenge doesn't need to be immediate. It doesn't need to be explosive. The most satisfying revenge is patient. The most satisfying revenge is inevitable. They would see it. They would feel it. And when the moment came, there would be no escape. Then came the first real sign that my observations were working. Chloe called, her voice trembling slightly, a departure from the confident, carefree tone she always used. "Mom, Ethan, something's wrong with the bank account. The funds aren't showing up. We can't access anything." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a quiet breath. "Chloe, maybe you should double-check everything with the bank. Mistakes happen all the time." Her voice wavered. "No, Mom. It's serious. I don't know what to do. I let the silence stretch, letting her panic grow just enough to seed the fear. Then I spoke, softly. Sometimes, Chloe, the decisions we make without thinking about others, they come back to us. She didn't respond. And in that silence, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The first cracks were appearing. They always think the person they hurt will break first. They don't realize that sometimes the quiet ones become dangerous in ways no one expects. After Chloe's panicked call about the frozen account, the small, steady anger inside me stopped being a reflex and started becoming a plan. It took some time to recognize the shape of that plan. Revenge, I decided, would not be a single blow. It would be a patient architecture. Blueprints drawn in crumbs of evidence, laid brick by brick, until whatever they had built on my loss began to wobble and crumble under its own weight. The first thing I did was what any good architect does. I took stock. Every paper, every receipt, every email. I sat at my little rented kitchen table and spread everything out like a deck of cards. The original deed, the transfer papers Ethan had asked me to sign, copies of emails from the buyer's agent, screenshots of their social posts, bank notices, a sticky note I had kept from the morning they left with the movers, a grocery list Ethan had thrown into the box by mistake. It all looked so ordinary, so harmless when separated. But arranged next to each other, it became a map. It became evidence. I started to catalogue dates, times, transaction IDs, the names of people who had signed forms. I wrote down every conversation I could remember, the exact words Ethan had used when he told me to trust him. I didn't do this out of obsession. I did it out of strategy. I had learned, painfully, that emotion makes for messy revenge. Precision, patience, truth. Those would be my weapons. The next move was legal counsel. I called an attorney I found through a friend, not some flashy lawyer on billboards, but a quiet woman who specialized in property disputes and consumer fraud. Her office smelled of old books and coffee. She asked questions that made me realize how much I had allowed my world to be manipulated because of love. I handed her copies of everything and watched her eyebrows knit, not with judgment, but with the same focused calculation that now lived inside me. "You did well to keep these," she said softly, flipping through the papers. "There are questions here, timing, signatures, possible misrepresentations, that need answers. We can open an inquiry, we can subpoena records, but you need to be prepared for how long this will take." I nodded. Long didn't scare me. Long was my ally. She suggested a few practical steps. Freeze anything still tied to the sale if possible. Notify the bank of suspicions, and open a discreet civil inquiry first to see if the buyer's paperwork was legitimate. She also mentioned partnering with a forensic accountant if needed. I listened and agreed. Every professional word she spoke felt like scaffolding I could climb. But legal moves alone, I knew, wouldn't be enough to satisfy the particular kind of justice I wanted. I wanted them to feel the unraveling, the cold drip of consequence that comes not from a courtroom lecture, but from life falling apart because they thought they could take without consequence. To get that, I would need to manipulate the small fractures in their arrogance. I would need to be invisible until the moment of collapse. One of the first things I did was go back through the digital breadcrumbs they had left. Chloe's social media was a treasure trove. It was like watching someone torch their own house and then post the videos, photos of receipts, a boomerang of a contract with a realtor. Though the image was blurred, I could see the agent's logo. A casual comment from Ethan about fast paperwork that made my skin crawl. People expose themselves when they are unguarded. I took screenshots. I archived posts. I saved them in a folder labeled simply evidence. Then I became strategic about what I revealed and what I didn't. Rage wants to shout. Revenge wants to whisper. I told exactly 2 friends the truth about the sale. My neighbor from the old block, Mrs. Alvarez, who still remembered Daniel's laugh, and a church volunteer named Mark, who had once run a legal clinic. Both of them were dependable, and both had a way of being useful without making a show of it. Mrs. Alvarez looked at the papers I showed her, then said, "You kept these?" That was smart. Honey Mark volunteered to introduce me to someone, a private investigator he'd known from volunteer work. I accepted. The private investigator, a man named Lewis, had been retired from police work for years. He smiled at me with tired eyes and asked no questions about my motives. He listened to the facts, then said plainly, "They made mistakes." People who steal with confidence often forget the details. He began to work quietly, confirming who the buyer was, checking public records, speaking with the title company. Within a week, Lewis came back with something that made my stomach drop and my resolve sharpen. The buyer's identity didn't line up. The company listed as the buyer had dissolved months before the purchase. The address on the contract was a mailbox at a commercial forwarding company. Lewis's voice was low as he said, "They used shell paperwork to clear the sale quickly. If you had handed over keys and left, the trail might have been gone. But something's messy here. Messy was better for me than clean. Mess meant their house was built on shaky legs." We began to draft a plan that married legal pressure with social consequences. My attorney would draft a letter requesting documentation for the buyer, proof of funds, identity verification, notarization of signatures. Lewis would dig into the realtor's history. We would not make demands. We would ask questions. People who had something to hide tended to panic when the light moved toward them. Meanwhile, I continued to play the invisible role at home. I called Ethan on normal evenings, asking about his job, about Chloe's new boutique she wouldn't stop talking about. I asked with the same gentle cadence that used to soothe scraped knees and broken hearts. He answered with the same casual confidence he always had. That confidence was the real crime. They believed they had bought their way into a new class of life and that their past no longer anchored them. I let them enjoy it for a while, let them dance in borrowed light. But I also nudged small hints into the world around them. I began to ask neighbors at the grocery store if they had seen the buyers around the old neighborhood. I mentioned casually to the property manager of the apartment building down the street, whose wife I'd known for years, that I was running a few checks. That gossip, the small-town equivalent of gasoline, began to warm the air. People asked questions. People remembered small, odd things. A man in a suit arriving late at night to look at the house. A paper truck that claimed to be from a title company but looked unfamiliar. None of it was damning on its own. But like smoke, these whispers would irritate those who had something to hide. One of the most satisfying parts of planning was watching their overreach. I learned that Chloe had taken a short-term loan to furnish their new apartment to appear more prosperous than they were. Ethan had put large sums into a startup based on a charismatic promoter's promises. They were not investing wisely. They were inflating an image. The shell buyer had given them enough money to get started, but not enough to secure their dreams. The more I watched, the more I realized they were walking a tightrope over a chasm they hadn't been invited to cross. I did something small that was purely psychological, and I confess I smiled when it worked. I mailed a simple, anonymous note to Chloe. Check the paperwork again. No signature, no threats, just a nudge. For someone sitting on a house sale built on shaky documents, the suggestion to check again is a seed of fear. She called Ethan that night. And for the first time since they'd left, I heard panic in her voice when she spoke. They started to question. They started to check. And when people start to question, they fumble. Professionally, we began pressing for formal verification. My attorney filed a quiet demand for the buyer's bank confirmations and notarized identity. Lewis found discrepancies in the realtor's licensing records. There had been complaints in another county about hurried sales and sloppy paperwork. The title company admitted they had used an expedited service because the buyer wanted a quick close. Expediency in real estate often means corners were cut. Those corners would prove to be the threads I needed. And because I wanted the collapse to be public, not to humiliate them for me, but so that they would feel the consequences of their choices in the faces of people who knew them, I also started to lay social traps. I didn't bully them. I didn't shame them. I let the world around them do what the law would eventually do. I sent an email to a local community group they were part of. A simple note about verifying property transfers when a neighbor sells. It was general information, framed as civic advice. But in the age of social networks and neighborhood apps, messages like that travel fast, and they reach people who will talk. Every piece moved toward the fold. The legal channel warmed, the private investigations gathered corroboration, and their confidence began to show micro cracks. Ethan called less often. Chloe stopped posting lavish photos. Once, I saw a comment on a photo from a friend of theirs asking about the house sale. Chloe had replied evasively, and the friend's response was blunt and skeptical. The world is less tolerant than we imagine when confronted with obvious inconsistency. There were moments when doubt swelled in me. Was I becoming cruel? Would I ever be satisfied? Whenever that question rose, I would take out the old photo of Daniel with his hands dirty from a day's work, grinning at us with pride. I would remember the nights I skipped meals so Ethan could have pizza at a youth meeting. I would remember the day he had told me I didn't understand how the real world worked. And I would let my conviction harden. This wasn't about punishment alone. It was about restoring the narrative of my life that they had tried to overwrite. It was about making sure that people who treated family like collateral would see the cost. By the end of the second month of quiet work, we had enough to push. My attorney prepared formal letters that would compel the buyer, the realtor, and any associated companies to produce proof. Lewis had lined up contacts at the title registry and had collected testimonies from people who had seen suspicious activity around the time of the sale. The bank, prodded by professional concern rather than a lone mother's panic, had begun to ask uncomfortable questions. In short, the machine of consequence had started to hum. I remember the day I handed over the final folder to my attorney to file. It felt like delivering a petition to the sky. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a fierce, almost calm triumph. Revenge, I knew then, would not be a shout. It would be the inevitable sound of truth catching up to a lie. And that sound would echo louder than any scream. When you build a plan quietly, the moment you set it in motion feels less like fireworks and more like a long, slow turning of a key. There was no dramatic laughter, no cinematic reveal. There was only the patient hum of paperwork being filed, the small, sure movements of professionals doing their jobs, and my heartbeat syncing with the steady tempo of consequence. It started with the letters. My attorney's office sent out formal notices, not the kind that scream accusations into the void, but the kind that asked for documentation under penalty of inquiry, notarized proof of funds from the buyer, bank confirmations of deposit, identity verifications, and clear title chain records. Each letter was written in careful prose, citing statutes and deadlines. One by one, those letters landed on desks where people would not ignore them. The first response came from the title company. Their initial email was politely defensive. They had used an expedited processing service. Their files showed all required signatures. The paperwork had been verified. But their words were thin. It's easy to be confident when you've only skimmed a document. When they were pressed, when our attorney requested original hard copies and proof of verification processes, their language shifted. Delays appeared. We are locating the original file. We apologize for the delay. That vagueness in reply is like the first crack in a foundation you never knew had been built on sand. Lewis, the private investigator, provided a critical piece early on. He had traced the buyer's payment to a wire that had moved through several shell accounts before landing in theirs. The paper trail was intentionally circuitous. It was the kind of choreography that people who wanted to hide money use. And people who facilitated it often made the mistake of leaving a tiny breadcrumb for those who looked closely. That breadcrumb was a small invoice from an ancillary company that had been used to justify the funds. Its address matched a mailbox service. The phone number was disconnected. Lewis's discovery changed the nature of the inquiry from a simple title check to a potentially criminal pattern of fraud. When the bank received an official request from my attorney and then a subpoena, they moved more decisively than anyone had expected. My attorney had framed it not as a mother's plea, but as a properly documented concern about irregular transfers. The bank responded by initiating an audit of the accounts tied to the sale. Audits are clinical things. They do not care about feelings. They care about ledgers, timestamps, and missing signatures. And once the auditors started asking questions, the house of cards began to tremble. It was a weekday morning when Ethan called, his voice clipped, more brittle than I'd ever heard it. "Mom, the bank says there's some kind of hold on the funds. They want paperwork from the buyer, but the buyer's attorney says it's all good." His attempt at calm sounded thin, like tissue paper over an angry stove. "Ethan," I said slowly, letting the weight of my voice do some of the work. "The bank is doing what banks do. They investigate. It will be fine if everything is as you say." He didn't answer for a long time. In that silence, I could feel him trying to stitch together a lie. When he finally spoke, the words were rushed and small. "Mum, Chloe's freaking out. She thinks the realtor did something. She says we should talk to a lawyer." "Then do it," I interjected gently. "Do it properly. Don't rely on quick fixes." He hung up after that. I didn't call back. I didn't need to. The wheels were turning. Within a few days, the realtor who had handled the sale reached out to our attorney. His voice was oily with practiced ease on the initial call. Too many rehearsed professionals sound like actor voices, and it makes them brittle when real scrutiny arrives. He provided a packet of documents purporting to show verification, but Lewis had already pulled records of the realtor's prior transactions and discovered a pattern. Several quick sales, expedited closings, and a handful of clients who later complained about missing signatures or misrepresented funds. Complaints weren't proof, but they were a pattern. Patterns expose intent. Then there were the small public things I had wanted. Neighborhood gossip is a force. Once the notice to the buyer's email was filed and certain public records began to bear our questions, the neighborhood app lit up. "Did you hear about that house? We saw a late-night showing. Wanted to know who the buyers were." People began to ask around. A neighbor who had seen the buyers, a suited man who took photos with his phone and left quickly, came forward and described the stranger he'd seen. His description didn't match the carefully curated image Ethan had been posting. It matched a guy who looked like he worked for a management company, not a proper buyer. It was a small thing, But small things accumulate. They started to lose control. Panic changes people. What they had shown to the world as confidence frayed into apology and then into accusation. Ethan called me once, voice raw, anger peeking through the panic. "Why are you doing this?" "Mum, you can't go after Chloe and me like this. We only did what we had to. What you had to do was sell your mother's house without asking her," I said. I didn't shout. I let the simple truth land. "You thought there would be no consequence." His reply was a string of harsh words, then silence. I could hear Chloe muttering in the background. "We'll get through this," she whispered. The bravado was gone. Only the tremor remained. Then, like dominoes, other doors began to open. The county title office found that the notary who had signed one of the buyer's documents had been out of office that day according to their payroll log. The notary's stamp was in the file, but their name didn't match the signature. Clerical errors, the title company insisted, but clerical errors that point to the same small cluster of anomalies are not reassuring. The buyer's listed corporate entity was dissolved in public records months earlier and had no bank account matching the wire used. Someone had manufactured a way to make funds look like they came from a legitimate source. Fabrications are slippery things. They get slick under pressure. As the evidence stacked, the bank's freeze became more severe. Lines of credit they had opened against the house were called in by lenders who suddenly didn't want exposure to questionable collateral. Chloe's short-term loan companies used the terms in their agreements to pull back financing when the house's legitimacy was called into question. What had been a house of easy money suddenly had a neon sign: risk. Investors are allergic to risk when it threatens legal exposure. The first time Ethan stood at my door after that, I felt something close to pity. He was thinner, his suit rumpled, the confident posture he had once used like armor reduced to a parched, strained set of shoulders. Chloe's eyes were rimmed red. She looked like someone who had not slept in days. She tried to stand firm. Ethan tried to talk loudly and angrily to create cover for his fear. But I could see through them as easily as I had seen him when he was a child, pretending not to be scared of the dark. "Mum?" Ethan said without preamble. "We didn't know. Nobody told us. The realtor did what he does," I said quietly. "He made a sale. You signed what you were told to sign. We trusted him," Chloe said, and the single phrase hung in the air like a plea. "We were told it was clean." Trust is an expensive thing when it's an excuse. I felt the heat of anger peel away, only to be replaced by a different tone. A cool, clinical response that matched the legal universe I had brought into motion. I answered, not with a speech, but with a fact. The notary's time card, the shell company's dissolution notice, the odd wire trail. I laid the documents on the kitchen table one by one and watched their faces change. Where once there had been arrogance, now there was a dawning understanding of how far they had overreached. After that visit, Ethan avoided me for days. He started returning calls reluctantly, always with some new update about the bank, the realtor, the misunderstanding. Each update was a self-revelation. Chloe called me once, voice small and cracking. "Mum, I don't know what to do. Our credit lines are frozen. The landlord's calling. I don't know where to get the furniture payments I listened, as I had listened to him when his toys were broken and his heart was bruised. But this time, the hurt was different. This time, it was a wound they had made for themselves. Public exposure followed next, in the way I had planned. My attorney prepared a civil notice that would be file accessible and thus public record. We weren't trying to destroy them in the press. We were trying to create a legal paper trail that no amount of social media gloss could erase. Once the notice was on the record, some of the influencers in our neighborhood app picked it up, and whispers became questions. People began to ask not just what had happened, but why. Rumors of sketchy realtors circulated. A local reporter called to ask for comment about sophisticated property scams in the area, and my attorney responded with measured facts. The story was not sensationalized for the sake of headlines. It became a cautionary tale about not rushing big decisions and the risk of relying on fast money. That little echo in the public sphere mattered more than I expected. Friends of Ethan's who had been posting his apartment photos began to remove them. Sponsors he had hoped to impress for a side hustle reached out with cautious distance. The calls he expected for partnerships dried up. Image is fragile. When it cracks, it rarely mends neatly. I watched all of this as if it were a stage production, and sometimes I was director, sometimes audience, sometimes both. There was a particular satisfaction in watching them try to stitch their lives back together with threads that had been cut. Chloe started to email me, asking about small things she had left behind at the house, a vase, the original piano bench. Her messages were polite, but they read like apologies folded into shopping lists. I answered them with surprising gentleness. When she asked if she might come by to collect small things, I said yes. It felt important to me that she look into the house one last time, not to gloat, but so she could see what she'd taken. She came on a rainy day, umbrella dripping, her eyes fixed as if on a script. She moved slowly, touching the table, lifting a framed photograph and looking at it as if it were an artifact. For a moment, something unspooled in her face. It was not fully contrition. That often takes longer than one visit. But it was a crack. She paused by the piano and put her hand on the wood where Daniel used to place his palm. I watched her for a long time and felt no triumph. I felt a steady, cold satisfaction, the kind that says justice is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like rain washing away the dust from a window, revealing what's been hidden. Ethan's final unraveling came not as arrest or public spectacle, but as a slow collapse of the life they had staged. Loans were called in. The landlord, whose lease had been signed under the assumption of stable income, gave notice when the payment line flagged. Investors pulled out of the startup Ethan had touted when it became clear their collateral was under legal review. As the fabric frayed, his anger curdled into blame, not just outward at the realtor or the shell company, but inward at himself and painfully at me. He'd come to my door once and shouted that I had ruined his life. It was a bitter, misdirected cry. The boy I had raised had become a man who could not see how his own choices had stacked up. There was a moment when I could have stepped back, when I could have offered him a safety net. I remember sitting at the small kitchen table in the apartment where I had retreated and thinking, what will feel better, safer, expedient, revenge satisfied, or mercy given? My answer was not cruelty. It was restoration on my terms. I refused to be the reason he learned nothing. He needed to face the consequence of his greed to see the crack in his own heart. So I did not bail him out. I offered no money, no easy solution. I offered instead a paper, a letter, and a condition. We would help him in the long run if he acknowledged the harm, if he took responsibility and worked to make restitution. My attorney drew up terms that were fair, not to ruin him, but to ensure he could not merely wash his hands and walk away. He needed to understand the cost of his choices. He needed to rebuild with humility, not shortcuts. When Ethan accepted the terms a month later, beaten and quiet, I felt a deep, cavernous exhaustion. The victory tasted neither sweet nor bitter. It tasted like the end of a long task. He would work to repay, slowly, with honesty. Chloe left for a family she said she still had in another state. Her messages grew less frequent. The social posts stopped. Their image of easy abundance dissolved into the slow, steady work of repair. By the time the legal dust settled, the title to the house had been called into question formally. The shell buyer's documentation was insufficient. The title company had missed key verification steps. The sale was voided pending full verification, and by then the anxious financial ecosystem that had been propped up on the sale money had already collapsed. Lenders reclaimed assets. The realtor faced disciplinary inquiry. The buyer's trail faded into a set of dissolved companies and unreachable phone numbers, the kind of sophisticated scam that leaves victims tangled in bureaucracy for years. I did not celebrate in public. I did not parade their fall. I simply returned to a quiet life that had the slow rhythm of ordinary mornings and the steady hum of a kettle on a stove. There was peace in small things again, in planting a few seeds in a borrowed window box, in reading a book, in sitting with neighbours who brought casseroles and smiles. My revenge had not been loud, but it had been delivered exactly as I had intended, with patience, precision, and the structural force of truth. When I think back to those months, I do not remember fireworks. I remember documents, phone calls, the sound of a printer, the polite rustle of lawyers' envelopes. I remember Chloe's hand on the piano and Ethan's hollow eyes. I remember feeling, finally, as if the scaffolding of my life had been restored, not by money or law, but by the fact that I had refused to be erased. Execution had begun not with violence, but with the cold efficacy of proof. There was a lesson there. People forget that legality is as absolute as gravity. Lies can hover for a while, but eventually, if gravity applies, they fall. And in their fall, sometimes the only thing you need to do is point toward the ground and let the truth do the rest. Revenge doesn't come with fireworks. It doesn't shout or dance or demand to be seen. It's quiet, almost graceful. Like the sound of a door clicking shut behind someone who never realized they were walking out for the last time. After the bank froze Ethan and Chloe's assets, everything unraveled quickly. The house they flaunted online went into foreclosure within weeks. Their credit cards were cancelled, their savings drained by legal fees, and the friends who once filled their parties disappeared as fast as the champagne bubbles. Chloe called me first, not Ethan. Her voice trembled through the phone. "Mum, please, you have to help us. We're being sued. The bank—" I didn't say a word for a full 10 seconds, just listened. Her breathing, sharp and panicked, reminded me of how I had once felt when I saw movers taking away my furniture. Then I said softly, "Didn't I tell you?" Actions have a way of circling back. She started to cry, but I ended the call before she could find her words. 2 days later, Ethan came to my door. He looked thinner, older, like the weight of his choices was crushing his spine. He stood there, on the same porch where I'd once handed him lemonade after football practice. "Mum," he said, voice cracking. I made a mistake. I could have hugged him. A part of me wanted to, but the mother he betrayed had died the day he sold her home for a down payment on greed. "I know," I said. "We all make mistakes. But some of us have to live with them." He tried to explain, to justify it. Said he thought I'd forgive him, that he wanted to secure a better future. I looked at him the way a stranger might. If that was your idea of a future, I hope it was worth burning the past for. He left without another word. The sound of his car fading into the distance was strangely peaceful. Over the next few months, News reached me in fragments. Chloe filed for divorce after Ethan's business collapsed. She tried to keep their remaining money, but most of it was gone, seized during the investigation. Ethan moved to another state, taking odd jobs to survive. Chloe vanished from social media entirely. And me? I rebuilt. Slowly, deliberately. I sold what little I had left and bought a small cottage by the lake. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Fully, legally, unquestionably mine. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise stretch across the water. The quiet felt earned. The peace tasted like justice. But there were nights when the silence hummed with memories. His laughter as a child, his tiny hands reaching for mine. I'd wonder if revenge truly healed, or if it just replaced one wound with another. Yet even in those moments, I knew I wouldn't change what I did. Because forgiveness, I realized, isn't owed. Especially not to those who mistake kindness for weakness. A year later, on a cold autumn morning, I received a letter. It was from Ethan. He wrote that he'd found work, that he was trying to get his life together. He said he was sorry, truly sorry, and that one day he hoped I might forgive him. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not to throw it away, but not to answer it either. Some stories don't need a sequel. I didn't need him to apologize to move on. I'd already done that the day I took back control of my life. Now, when I walk past the mirror, I see someone different. Not the broken mother who once cried herself to sleep, but a woman who stood up, fought back, and won in silence. People often think revenge is about destruction, but it's not. Real revenge is about reclamation, taking back what was stolen, not just in money, but in dignity. Sometimes, when the wind carries a faint echo across the lake, I swear I hear his voice calling, "Mom." But it's only the breeze, the past trying one last time to reach me. I smile, sip my coffee, and whisper to no one in particular. You taught me what betrayal costs. I hope the lesson was worth the price. Then I turn back to the sunlight, letting it warm my face. Because in the end, my revenge wasn't just about making them pay. It was about reminding myself that even after the deepest betrayal, I could still rise, and I did.